All right, Micah, we're moving on down through your list of your timeline of events here. So we're on to the next one that you've entitled, Her Doctors Demand Access to Me. Dr. Carlton, MUSC, March 1987. Take it away, sir.
Okay, it had been a year since the death of my grandfather, and I thought, even in reflection now, I was coping with it fairly well. Of course, he was one of my biggest heroes in life, especially, not just concerning the first thing that we spoke of, where, he basically saved me from, I dare say, part of myself. With him being out of my life, everyone knew how close we were, but my mother began asking me some curious questions that I know now was kind of like, analyst questions about a person's psyche. She was asking me if I had been upset, if I needed to talk or anything like that. And I was rather nonchalant, actually, going on with my life. And then one day she came to me and said, Micah, there's some people that would like to talk to you. And I'm like, first thing in my mind was, what did I do? I'm in trouble. But actually, that wasn't the case. She said, there's some people that would like to talk to you in Charleston. And I'm like, oh, what about? They said, they just want to see, they just, want to know how you're doing. And I'm just, this is Mom. So I'm like, well, I didn't put two and two together that she had been talking about me to someone. And I kind of felt like this is what she wanted me to do, and I just wanted to make her happy. At the time, I believe I just turned 13, I want to say. Actually, I was about to turn 14 later that year. We went down to Charleston, and everybody in the area surrounding Charleston, for those that don't know, literally you could be 100 miles away, but at some point, if you have a big family, one of your family members is going to be there. It's some of the top-notch medical treatment you can get. And even in the 80s, it was one of the places that held the claim to fame of one of the first successful heart transplants of a young man. And, so they were on the cutting edge. Well, instead of going what I was familiar with, because our relatives had been on the new VIP floor, that was the 10th floor, but in its history, that was the psychological ward. And she took me to the 7th floor. That was the new psych ward at that time. Before, I believe since then they've built a different building for it. And anyways, I went in and I met with a gentleman by the name of Dr. Carey. He was a very, very wonderful man. He was very enthusiastic, charismatic, and I feel even today he was genuinely concerned for my well-being. Well, they asked me, of course, a lot of questions, and then I was told that they were going to keep me there for an evaluation. And I'm like, I'm not understanding it. I knew I wasn't in trouble, but I felt like I was, part of me felt like I was. I didn't comprehend this, and I'm like, I finally asked the question I probably should have asked at the beginning. I was like, why? And they said, well, and here was his words, we notice you've been depressed over the last year since the death of your grandfather. You know, as I got older, that kind of clicked. Why would he say it that way? What, you know, how long were they getting information on me? And of course, you know, as an adult, I kind of go more to why were they getting information on me? Well, I ended up staying there for about 2 weeks. They said, hey, we have this medicine we would like for you to take. It'll help you, you know, it's an antidepressant. And I had never heard of that. I actually remember the name of the medication was desipramine. And me, look, I'm not going to lie. When I was a kid, you know, you want to experiment with things. I had not really done that. And my peers that I was housed with in the adolescent unit, they were saying, hey, they'll give you these really cool, you know, medications if you tell them you see stuff, this and that, man. Oh, it'll make the days go by so much better. And I'm like, well, I don't know about all that, but yeah, I'm going to try and figure this out. Well, the medication, I honestly didn't really notice any effects from it. But one thing I did notice was that I actually, in a period of time, enjoyed being there. I mean, I was an only child. This was, other than going to summer camp for 5 days in summer '85, I had never really been in a co-ed environment as such. And I had made friends. And it almost had a family type feeling. Well, they came to me one day. Now, to be clear, Dr. Carey was my psychiatrist. There was a very old man, not that old at the time, but he had some age to him, and his name was Dr. Carlton, and he was the head psychologist. Now, for those that don't know, a psychiatrist does not prescribe medications to you. That would be the duty of the psychologist. At least that's how it worked at that time. I'm not sure if it's changed any. And he put me through, I had a meeting with him. This was about my second week there. And he put me through a series of just very inquisitive questions. And the takeaway from it was, he said, I'm going to try you on this other medication and see how you react to it. It might help you out. That medication, I mean, I'll go into what I discovered it was later, but that medication was called Navane, Navane. And about I did notice the effects of it. I was literally forgetting things that I was about to do right then. I enjoyed just sitting down and not talking. I felt like I was on autopilot just watching the world go around me, and it was like, I came up with this term a while back. It was like a narcotic lullaby that just never stopped singing. And I reacted to one of my fellow peers that went to go turn the TV off while I was sitting there, just completely zoned out to it. And the moment he turned the TV off, I snapped and I attacked him. And that wasn't me. I didn't know what I was doing. I had no control. I just knew that, hey, this is war. He just turned my TV off. Well, of course, it wasn't that vicious of attack because, I'm only, 13, so I never was a fighter or someone who was into violence. He They separated us, but that also lost me a level, which meant that there were times I couldn't go in the day room, but also it put me on a watch level to where I was not allowed to be by myself without being observed by any staff member. The only place I could was in the bathroom. You know, they didn't watch you using the facilities. Well, I dealt with it. I felt this was just punishment. And I went to go use my bathroom to go number 2. Now, I have to describe this bathroom. On the 7th floor, when you got off the elevator, the adolescent unit was right there on the right. At the end of the hall on the left was my room, but there was also like a little closet door, and they had made that into, just a toilet room. But as you sat on the toilet, you literally had a wall almost touching your right arm and left arm. It was that cramped. Well, while I was using the facilities, I noticed that my arms started twitching. And then I was confused. I was like, what's going on here? And all of a sudden, my entire neck, head, and body began spasming. And it all began, it was like the muscles on the right side of my body were pulling down and pulling me to my right. I was contorting, and I was freaking out. And all this, and it did it so hard that I got wedged into that bathroom while I'm sitting on the commode. That's why I described the amount of space I had. It was, my body locked me up while I'm going into a no different than a waking seizure, where I was completely lucid of everything around me, and I'm screaming. The staff members finally came to me, opened the door. It took them some doing, but they were able to unwedge me, and I just kept I was screaming in pain because my muscles were tearing. I was, it was extremely painful. They gave me a Benadryl tablet and said, here, take this real quick, this will help you. And and I remember I chewed it up. They didn't even tell me to do that. It was like part of me at that point realized if I chew it up, it'll hit me quicker. So I did, and it was the spasms after about 10 minutes started slowly dying away, and it was like a huge breath of fresh air. Well, they had me at that time on a bed outside of my room because of the observation I had to go under. And while I'm on that bed, all of a sudden, just not even a few minutes later, the spasms began again, and this time they came back with a vengeance. It was extremely painful. I've kind of gotten over the psychological damage of not having control of my body at that moment. But this time, they said it was Benadryl, which I have no reason to not believe them, but they gave me a shot in my thigh, and it worked so fast in stopping this waking seizure and severe spasm that I remember thinking then, gosh, why didn't they give this to me to begin with, Well, they kept me out there. The following morning, I met with Dr. Carlton, not Dr. Carey, and he began asking me details about what I was feeling just before that happened. He was trying to gauge a lot of information about it. He just kept asking me the same questions over and over, which now I know that it was pretty much to see if my answers were consistent, like a lot of, trick questions to purify the answer. And I don't know. I know I was honest with him on everything, and he said, well, we're going to wean you off of that medicine. I know you probably don't want to take it anymore, but we can't just take you off of it once it's in your system. We have to give you slow doses to wean you off. And I understood that. Well, they weaned me off over the next few days. And here's the part where everything did not come together then, but it laid the foundation for me to understand things at a later date. My mother and my stepfather were coming up for a family group session, and I had not seen them since I had been admitted there. And it had been one heck of a wild ride. So when they took us to, it was this big group room with a one-way glass that we all used once a week for, adolescent group therapy. My mom and my stepdad were in there, and I ran to her, man. It was, the longest I had ever been away from my mother in my entire life. And me and her were very close. And I remember us talking, and all of a sudden, Dr. Carlton walked in. And when he did, my mother stopped mid-sentence, got this unique look on her face that was just, I can't describe it, but the only way to describe it was you could go either way with what emotion you thought she was feeling at that time. And that's kind of my adult description of it now, looking back. Back then, I really didn't pay any mind to it. But she immediately got up and ran to him. I thought she was going to tackle him. Approximately 4 feet in front of him. Now, he never made a move. He never said a word. He just stood there. He stood there and looked directly at her. When she got 4 feet away, it was like she stopped at a brick wall, and she froze like a robot. And there was a long 2 or 3 seconds, and I suddenly heard his voice say, "Hello, Janice." And it was like the brick wall was gone. She reached out and she hugged him. And he hugged her back. And she turned around. And me and my stepfather, sitting in the back of the room, seeing all this, we both actually exchanged a look like, what is going on here? And then looked back, and then that happened. And as she's walking back to me with him, she goes, "Micah, you're in very good hands. This was my doctor when I was here." That kind of blew me away because I never knew my mother had been a patient there. I didn't understand. I'm like, wait a second. All this stuff is going through my mind. Well, we went through the group family session. They kept reverting and speaking about the death of my grandfather and my depression, how I was acting different, and that there was nothing wrong with it. This was, they attributed it to him being so close to me and that being my first experience with loss. And as an adult now, I really don't know how they ascertained that, but, respectfully to my mother and those doctors, that wasn't the case at all, in my opinion. Well, the following day, The session lasted a short while. I got to visit with them for about an hour after, and then they left. The following day, they told me, when I woke up in the morning, they're like, okay, they've got a test arranged for you. So we need you're going to have to stay awake tonight. I'm like, okay. Well, that night, they had a staff member with me, and I ended up staying awake literally all night. And the following day, I'm waiting for this test, and they said, well, no, you've got a little while longer to go. I believe it was later in that evening, just roughly by my math. I was awake for 32 hours. Now, even though I have chronic insomnia, that medication had me on a sleep schedule. And it didn't feel right to me, but part of me was not used to that. So it was kind of foreign. But to kind of shoot ahead a little here, the doctor had ordered what is called an EEG. And when I finally went in for this test, they said it was a sleep test. And they put all of these electrodes all over my head, and they put me in a nice warm bed and said, okay, you can go to sleep now. And I'm like, oh, finally, and well, that was that. The sleep test was done. I was weaned off that medication, and I discovered, and as I was there, I'm sitting there. Now, Dr. Carlton, I met with him several more times. I never brought up my mother, and neither did he. But to shoot ahead a little bit, when I asked my grandmother, long after my mother had departed, about that situation, she said, well, Micah, all I'll say is they put your mother on that same medicine they gave you back in 1967. And it was the same doctor that gave it to you. And I don't like that man. And she left it at that. It seemed like a very sore subject, so I didn't push it, and I realized my grandmother, it seemed very painful for her to speak of. So I left it at that. And that, for the most, is a great reason of why I feel there was a lot more behind the scenes concerning that. Because as I alluded to at the very beginning of this, concerning, being in the dark about my IQ test results, my mother was kept in the dark as well. In the early 60s, she was given her IQ test, and it was phenomenally high. They had never seen one so high in that school area of Georgetown. And over time, I started wondering why. I couldn't help but wonder if there was a possibility, because of her IQ level and also mine, that they were possibly, as conspiratorial as it sounds, I have to state the facts. I really wonder if it was they were trying to garnish some type of data, medically or however, from us both on the effects of that drug. That drug has been discontinued. As I didn't know what it was for years, I was always told that I was allergic to it. There were job interviews I went for or things like that. When they would put known allergies, very innocently enough, I would put that down. And I wouldn't get that job. And finally, it took a person that actually had some medical field expertise that was giving me an interview. And when she saw that on my paperwork, she said, "Why on earth were you given Novocaine?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't know." This, it was, I explained the situation. She goes, no one should ever give that to a teenager. And that's when I began discovering something very painful, that medication was an antipsychotic. It was basically the harbinger of other medications, such as what is more common today, Seroquel and many others that were made to sedate a person, just to make it, to give them what I used to call the Thorazine march. And for the most, there will be some relation to this at a later date, later on in the conversation, but that's pretty much, I feel, though I don't have open proof, but just by the way everyone worded everything, the doctor saying, "We have been noticing," discussing the previous year of my life before I met them. And also, one thing to add in, when I met my father, who was, him and my mother were divorced when I was very young. I only had 1 or 2 memories of him in it. When I met him when I was roughly just prior to me going to MUSC, he told me something that never really clicked even while I was there. He said, "Your mother was so sedated all the time, Micah, that I was like, look, I called her doctor and said, you have to quit giving her this. She's walking around a zombie." And they arranged for, he said, he didn't say the doctors, but I assume it would have been Dr. Carlton, because he said, "Micah, I took her to Charleston for a doctor visit, and when we were on the Cooper River Bridge leaving, she had not said a word." And he said, "Well, did they tell you anything about it?" And he told me, and I believe he believes he was telling the truth. I wasn't there. And even though, I don't like calling people a liar, I have to declare, it could be anything. My father was prone to embellish certain things, but he had a way of saying things that I learned were truthful. And I believe he was telling the truth. He said that she just said to him on the Cooper River Bridge as they were leaving, "Yes, they spoke to me about it." And he said, after a long moment of silence, he said, "Well, what did they say?" He said, "Micah, your mama looked at me and said, they told me to divorce you." And he said, "Oh," and that's where he kind of planted a seed that he had a concern of. And I believe it very genuine to him. He said, "Micah, those doctors messed her up." And you have to forgive me. This is, even though I'm going through it, this is a rather personal subject, but I can't help but get a little emotional at times about it, because I can only go off of these memories, and for some reason they haven't left me. And I just want to say, it's not like I'm trying to create some Scooby-Doo mystery to just bide my time with, to make up a fanciful story with. No. Because if this was a Scooby-Doo mystery, it was given to me on a silver platter.
Yeah, that's That's a lot for anyone to have to go through there, Micah. That's a lot for us to take in. I will ask the question, if I may, and not to take away from you and your mother's relationship by any stretch of the imagination. But did you ever think that maybe your relationship with your mother was as close as it was because maybe she saw a little bit of herself in you?
Very much so. Good question. Yup. She told me a lot of things that I thought was just what a loving mother said to their child that they feel is the most, precious gift to them. And just one I know is she constantly referred to, Micah, one day you're going to, she would say it in a way, Micah, you have some gifts, and one day you're going to understand them. And she said, but what I want you to know is I had those same gifts, but I misused them, and they were taken away from me. She never told me what or how that happened, but at that time, I just marked it off as just stuff a mom tells her kid. And, that actually, as this progresses, I'll go ahead and say it's my belief that, I'll just say there's not a day that goes by now that I don't go, I'm so sorry for not believing you, Mama. I'm so sorry.
That's a pretty profound statement she made, and highly interesting one at that. But yes, I can only imagine what you went through. Joey, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Mike, I got just a couple of questions, and I don't have my notes pulled up with me. About what time frame, what year was this again? I just remind the viewers of that.
Okay, the time at MUSC was just starting to be spring of 1987.
Okay.
I may not be exactly clear if it was the month of March, but it would have been in that time frame. I know it was 1987.
Oh, okay.
We actually made the news because me and my fellow adolescents, we, for stupid reasons and a lot of, cabin fever moments, we all escaped, about 5 of us, and we ran from the facility. We had one heck of a night all over Charleston, and one thing I would like to impart on how things look out for you is I ended up tapping out of this runaway scheme at about 2 o'clock in the morning when we're all walking through North Charleston. Yep, you know the area. Some areas of North Charleston are not nice, and they went ahead and left me, and I called Home Collect and said, Mom, I'll tell you where I'm at if you don't send me back there. She agreed, and I told her where I was located, and I ended up sitting behind a dumpster beside a store that was closed, and there were some people around that store that to me looked rather shady, and they kept looking at me, and I was so scared. And finally, this woman with red hair, dressed up like a lady of the night, walked behind the dumpster and said with the calmest voice, she said, honey, are you okay? And I said, yes, ma'am, I'm waiting on my ride to come get me. And she goes, honey, you need something? You need some food or anything? I'm like, I could really use a pack of matches or something because I've been trying to light my cigarette for an hour now. and it's not working with my dead lighter. And she walked me over to that store, pulled a key out of her pocket, opened the store, walked in, and got me a pack of matches and brought it out. And she told me, she said, look here, honey, if your ride doesn't show up, she gave me her room number, her name, and said, look here, you don't need to be out here for too long, but if you need a place to stay for the night, and if they don't come get you, promise me you'll come over there. And, you know, and that was it. That was the last I saw of her. But the reason I mentioned that is because that was the first point I had in life that I'm more than happy to share, despite the situation, that there are good people in this world where you least expect it.
And the reason I asked that question, Micah, is that, you know, in the hearing that story and being as profound as it is, and having some experiences with mental health treatments in the 80s is the basis, basically how you can put it. And it wasn't me, it was family members, but there was a big time of exploration and
I'll go ahead and shoot to the chase. Yes, my mother did expand her mind a little bit back in those days.
Well, no, I'm not talking about, you know, recreationally, and I don't condemn that at all. I'm talking about like in the psychiatric treatment community, they were doing a lot of experimentation and things like that with a lot of different things, medications and regimens and things like that, on people both that had pretty consistent symptoms, and people, the placebo groups, you know, like the control groups and things like that.
Correct.
Yeah. And I don't know, it just, that story sounds like you kind of got just tangled up in one or the other, you know what I mean? And then, you know, that's, you know, I don't, you know, the ethics of that and all of that could be obviously debated, but it sounds like, you know, definitely it was, whether you believe it or not, or, you know, things like that are traumas. You know, when you go through things like that, you go through parental separation at a young age, you go through essentially being even though you're young, you're a teenager, you don't really have all the rights you do as an adult, but you're still a free person when that freedom's kind of taken away from you and things like that. That's a traumatic experience. And, you know, that can affect you further and further down. And what I'm also hearing out of this, maybe in the undertone of it, is that both you and your mom may have had special premonition-like gifts and the ability to see or experience what we would, you know, often call the next dimension, or the, you know, the other side type thing, whereas, you know, a lot of people don't. And, you know, maybe that was the primer for all of that, and the treatment to see, are, is what they are experiencing real? And then if it is, what is it type thing, the next step. So that is really interesting that the medical community kind of took such interest of it, just a boy from Georgetown, and
exactly.
That's it's almost crazy, strange, and kind of really eerie at the same time. So I'm,
fortunately it wasn't eerie for me at the time, but as I got older and started reflecting on it with, my adult way of thinking, it was beyond eerie.
Yeah. Kind of to build up on what you just asked, Joey, but, I do have to ask this. I know what you have told us about what you experienced earlier on in life, but was there any given time that you kind of shared this with other people? Did you, were you so close to your mother that you shared these experiences with her? And that's kind of the reason I'm asking, because going into that event specifically, I know you mentioned that it kind of got brought up that you were, or the doctors I think had said that you were kind of experienced some depression after your grandfather passed. So my question was, did you share any of those experiences with her or anyone close to you at all?
No. I do. There is a chance that my grandfather could have shared the experience I had with, with the 1976 incident. There is a possibility, but I really don't feel he did because of the immediate. My mother would have been very inquisitive on that, the way she was then. And I don't recall her saying anything, but I very well could be wrong. You know, I was barely 4 years old, so. But there was one thing that still eludes me, and that is after she was there, allegedly for depression, they recommended her to a school for gifted children. And it was located, all I know is it was located in Rock Hill, South Carolina. And she went there for a period of time. What occurred there or anything, I don't know. But I only learned of it, and I'll try and keep this brief, but it is relative, when I went up in our attic when I was a teenager. And this is a few years before her passing. And I found a garbage bag that was busted open full of antique stamps, probably 20, 30 pounds of them. I mean, that many. I found a Pony Express stamp, Confederate War stamps, and even though I didn't know the exact value then, I knew these were valuable items. And I went downstairs and said, "Mom, whose stamp collection is that up there?" And she looked at me and she grinned and she said, "Micah, I've been waiting for you to find it. That's yours." And I said, "Mine?" She goes, "A long time ago, when I was in Rock Hill, I had a friend, and he gave away all his possessions, and he loved his stamp collection. It was a gentleman that was, and I know this because of some of the name that I found consistent in there. It was a gentleman by the name of Leo Finman from Charlotte, North Carolina. He was roughly her same age at the time, and that he gave her his stamp collection." And she said, and Micah, I told him, "I don't want to take it. You love this. You're always adding to it, taking such care of it." She said, he looked at me and said, "Take it, Janice. One day it will put your son through college." And that was her exact words about it. And that was also one of the references that got me to thinking, what the heck was this? What was going on at this school?
That was pretty interesting. But the reason I asked that question was because if nobody had known of your experiences, and it kind of makes me wonder, what was found. What was the commonality between your mother and you from a biological standpoint? What protein was discovered? What characteristic in your biology that had these people so up in arms, so to speak? I mean, that's kind of where my mind went with that.
Right. Well, one thing for you genetic nerds out there, you'll understand. I have had several DNA tests done for my mitochondria DNA, which would have been the exact match to my mother's mitochondria DNA, and so down the line, is H1C haplogroup. That does have some minor bearing, but the thing that I've concluded, of course, being the one that's thought on this the longest, and I would like to think very impartial, when I set myself outside the whole situation and I place a little Occam's razor reasoning to it, the most likely answer is one of the obvious ones. In 1967, they had just come out with that drug that they administered to my mother and myself. They were getting a second generational effect study. That would be the most valuable data they could get.
That's very interesting.
That actually, you're right. That makes 100% sense as well. Especially, you know, when we talk about second generational studies, you know, there's two kinds. There's relational and non-relational studies in that, and having somebody as closely related as mother and son following in the same study is extremely, you know, extremely valuable in the science community because it eliminates so many variables. But that would, again, you said it, it's the most likely answer. And they were, you know, whether or not you had, you know, you were exhibiting any special talents or any premonitive things, that second generational study, you know, you could have been the placebo for that or the control group. And so, yeah, that makes 100% sense in that.
And honestly, not to, you know, try and take away or defend myself in any way, because I realized through my life, innocently enough, when I said I was allergic to that medication, the eyebrows I raised, and gosh only knows what they thought of me, because it hurts to say it, but that's the type of stuff they give psychotic people. And, you know, it just feels more along the lines, you know, and it took a long time for me to come to that conclusion, but I really feel in my heart, honestly, if that gentleman was in charge of the psychology department and literally in charge of everything at that time, Dr. Carlton, there is no way he would not compare the two, even if at minimum it was to see if there was some conclusion he reached with my mother that may help with my treatment.
Correct. I would agree with that 100%.
All right, Micah. I know that was a bit of a long one, but an interesting one nonetheless.
And I appreciate the time for that. I really do. I'm trying to keep in the mindset to simplify things, but sometimes it's not always that easy.
All right, so moving on to the next event, we have what you titled Anonymously Narcotic 1988.
Yes. Just shortly after I was discharged from MUSC, that following summer, I had made some friends. And innocently enough, I was starting to get rather rebellious. There was part of me that was not getting along with my mother, my family. I was coming into an angry teenage lifestyle, and I met a group of friends that lived far away from me. So I decided to run away from home to go hang out with them. And it was pretty much, as I said, it was done for that fashion. You know, we were all metalheads. We all loved heavy metal, and growing up in Georgetown, there weren't too many people in that genre. It was either Grateful Dead or country. There was literally no in between. But
trust me, I understand that, Micah. Where I live, I literally am surrounded by cornfields, and I can't stand country or anything like that. I've been a metalhead since birth. So I get
awesome. Okay, and you know, and I was the same at that time. There was actually only one country song I'll always plug that I love to death, but I didn't like any other, and that was Pirates of Mississippi, Feed Jake. Best one ever. But back to it, I'd run away from home, and finally when I found out that, you know, they had law enforcement and everybody looking for me, I didn't want to get my friends in trouble, so I came home. And when I did, my mother decided, she said, Micah, we have a place that said they can help you. And boy, did I roll my eyes to that one right in front of her. And she saw it, and she said, no, Micah, really help you. She said, there's a runaway shelter that said they will take you and, you know, and maybe help you understand some of these things that made you run away. Or something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing. Well, they actually had an officer waiting outside to take me to a place called Sea Haven that was a runaway shelter up in Little River, South Carolina. I went there and, you know, met other kids my age again. It was a very nice place. There were people that had troubled backgrounds and things, but it was a home environment. It wasn't, you know, for me, it was much different than what I thought it was going to be, considering my stay at MUSC. While there, they had switched out, they would have husband and wife caretakers, and they had switched them out to this other group of caretakers. And I won't go into details because I don't want to smear anyone, but there was something inappropriate that occurred, and me and another gentleman witnessed it from one of the staff members. And we backed the gentleman in the corner and scared him so bad that they called the police department on us. Well, they ended up, we told them what we saw and everything, and they paid no mind to it. They took us straight to jail. Of course, us being underage, they just put us in a cell surrounded by all the other inmates. And mind you, this very first time I had ever been in a situation like that. Well, when they got me out, my mother came and picked me up, but there was a woman I had met at Sea Haven who had started taking me to Narcotics Anonymous meetings. And even though I was underage and everything, it was weird. I had a camaraderie with it. And not to mention, I enjoyed drinking really strong coffee, of which they had a lot of. Well, I continued. I got a sponsor in the NA program. I can say his name because he's, you know, I still go with the what you do here, what you see here, stays here. But this gentleman, his name was Dave. He was a few years older than me. He was more in-depth and heavy metal than I ever was, and he lived not far away from me, and we became literally best friends. He was, at that time, he was about 20 years old. I was, you know, I was about to turn 14 that summer. I turned 14 while I was, you know, still in the program. The drugs, now, Narcotics Anonymous, I had smoked marijuana once or twice. I did not have a fascination with it. It was not a priority, but that pretty much got me, you know, it got me into the program based on that, but I enjoyed the people. These were all the cool hangout party people, except they were sober and still having fun. And I needed that. That saved my life at that time to a degree, because it was every weekend we would go together. Hey, we're going to this meeting up in Myrtle Beach. We're going this meeting there. And I was meeting all these people, and I was hearing their stories unfettered. And I was learning so much of what can happen. And they were sharing the scars metaphorically on their body. And I was smart enough to realize, wow, they just gave me a key to never get that scar they have. And it was amazing. We used to go up to Myrtle Beach. Just to say playfully, there was a place called Beamer's that was a laser tag arena on Ocean Boulevard. And every Friday night, we would all go play laser tag after the meetings. And we even got to challenge the Myrtle Beach Police Department to a game of laser tag once, which was rather awesome. But it became a sober lifestyle, and I got to see that side along with the people that were giving me their open testimony because they cared. They didn't want to see someone make their same mistake, and I very much adopted that same mindset from that, and I'm proud of that. I have no shame of it because I've gone out of my way. If I've ever seen someone going down a similar road I could have gone down, of sharing, basically, like I had said earlier, the metaphorical scar so they don't have to get it themselves. Learn from someone else's mistakes is a simpler way of saying it. And I was in that program for almost a year. It was literally like a family. And, a very young age, and I learned to listen to some of these people and learn a lot. But that was pretty much, what the in-between was from between that and the next notation. It was, the reason I stated it is because it was like I went through one of the worst situations of my life, and then I actually found a family of people and friends of, that were just as cool as could be. They accepted me, and I didn't have much of that growing up in my area. But that pretty much was, concerning the anonymously narcotic notation.
All right, very good. Let's go ahead and jump to the next one, the State Asylum, 1988 to 89.
This is where it gets interesting. Well, I say that playfully more to myself. I had still been involved in that program. They were a great family to me. But I began, started through a hardcore version of puberty. So, of course, I was all about the girls as much as I could be. And I had some rejections. And of course, when you're young like that, you feel that, oh man, this is the worst in the world. This is the worst heartbreak. So I began penning poetry. And it was, if I could be man enough to say that if I were looking at the lyrics and poems I wrote then, as a parent of my child, I think I would be prompted to try and disseminate, whether that was a cry for help or a possible red flag, that they could be suicidal. I believe that's the position my mother was in when she found my poems. I had written a really heartbreaking one that I still remember to this day in verbatim. Won't recite it, but what I failed, and I think if I could go back in time, what I failed to do was basically let her know that, hey, Mom, when I read my own words on the paper, I felt free. It was like when I wrote the words and I got to read it, I got to read my physical words, it was like it was all gone. And I don't know if that would have helped anything, but she was concerned I may be suicidal. I was sent to, at first, Coastal Carolina Children's Hospital in Conway, South Carolina, that night that she discovered it. Law enforcement took me there. No, that night, no, it was my father, his girlfriend, and her, and they drove me there. And that was the first time I ever saw my mother and my real father together in the same vehicle, so it was kind of a mixture of emotions. But, you know, they were both pulling for me, and that was something that that did make an impact on me. Well, when I get to Coastal Carolina, I was there for a few days, and what I know now is that my insurance would not cover that place. So they transferred me to Greenland Park, which was at McLeod Hospital in Florence, South Carolina. And this was unique because it was, even though I was an adolescent, I was in with a co-ed adult ward. And again, I was noticing, you know, the people that were there, and I really noticed, hey, my problems are pittance compared to some of these people. And it wasn't that they were bad people, it's just the trauma and shock they had gone through in life. And once again, my insurance would not cover that place, so it was it was late one evening, and they said, Micah, we need you to get your things together. You're being transferred. And for some reason, even though they said transferred, I thought I was going home. So I was as happy as could be. Got all my stuff together, and next thing I know, an officer walks up to me, says, place your hands behind your back. And I looked at him. I'm like, well, what'd I do? He says, you're not in trouble. This is just procedure for transport. And that's the first time I ever had handcuffs placed on both my arms behind my back. And he transported me to William S. Hall Psychiatric Institute, Bull Street, Columbia, South Carolina, otherwise known as the State Hospital, or in days gone past, the South Carolina Lunatic Asylum. When I got there, they have a intake in which they ask you lots of questions. They give you a quick initial triage of an evaluation. And they immediately, upon mentioning of MUSC, they asked a standard question on intake, and they said, what type of medications were you taking while you were there? I told them dicipramine and Navane. When I said Navane, the guy dropped his pen and said, he looked at me and said, Navane? He said, no. Not what you got from another patient or something. He said something to that effect. And I said, no, they had prescribed it to me. It wasn't me just getting someone else's pill. He said, look here, kid. I know for a fact they don't give Navane to kids. And I'm trying to help you. And if you're going to keep lying to me, you know, this is not going to work out. You're not going to, you know, we're not going to be able to give you the proper treatment. And I told him, and it shocked me. I was like, no, I'm really not lying. And, well, he pushed past that, but he had very much an attitude at that point. And then when he said, well, what type of tests did they do on you? I was like, well, there was, you know, they did a EKG at one point, then they did a EEG, and I was like, yeah, they kept me awake for about a day and a half. And he goes, then he dropped his pen and said, look, you're not going to convince me that they sleep deprived you for a day and a half to do that test. You know, you really need to, don't you mean that they kept you up overnight? I was like, no, it was overnight and the following day, and then I did the test. And he goes, well, look, if you're going to keep lying to me, there's really nothing further we can discuss. And I didn't know how to feel because I was telling the truth, and that just put me a whole lot deeper into a guaranteed depression. Because not only had that been the first time I had ever been in cuffs, but that was the first time ever I had been in a locked facility like that place. I won't go into the details of which I could of my stay there, but I will say about a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks later, they had gotten my records from MUSC. Because when they brought me into a treatment team therapy, it wasn't the, look here, kid, are you going to tell us the truth yet? This time, they had people I had not seen before, and they said, so, tell us how this Navane affected you. And that right there told me, wow, I've been validated. They know I'm telling the truth now. Well, I felt an outpouring of wanting, it was a mixture of an emotion of, wow, they do believe me now. They know I'm telling the truth. Oh my gosh, finally. And I remember they asked lots of questions concerning it. They asked it concerning my sleep deprivation test and everything of that nature. They had me, they said, okay, you can go out there and wait for the staff member to take you back to the dorm. So I stood outside the door, and I'll never forget just the little bit I could hear. They said, well, if he possibly still has some of that residual in his system, there's nothing we can give him but amitriptyline. And for the next few months, off and on, there's a lot of stories in between, but I'm just going to try and stick to this. I ended up staying there 8 months. And I had worked my way up from the lowest level to the highest level of freedom you could get on those grounds. And I made friends that I still consider friends to this day. And also, I had experiences that shaped me for the better. But every few weeks, they would have me come in and they would ask me all that stuff all over again with a new person sitting in to the treatment team therapy. And to me, what I take away from it, and I feel even as horrible as that place was, they were not a university-funded facility. They were state and government-funded. That means they're always going to accept the lowest bidder on literally everything. They don't have a lot of a budget to deal with. But I feel they really saw something that was not supposed to occur with this other facility, and it may have done something to me. Because to me, it was just a gut feeling in my heart. As bad as that place could be, those were the good guys in this story. Because they wanted to get to the root of what happened. And at the end of my stay there, once again, I did learn later that my insurance ran out, and they, my social worker, Mr. Jim Taylor, and my psychiatrist, Miss Deborah Saunders, I remember them both fondly. They were wonderful people. They helped me through some dark times and really helped me learn to help myself with everything I was dealing with. They actually had me write a letter of what I would have said to my grandfather. They drove me from the facilities on Bull Street all the way to Georgetown, and we stopped at my grandfather's grave. I read the letter to him. I cried, and I took that letter and I placed it up under where the vase goes on his recessed monument, his recessed marker, and left it there. And again, they actually had said that we feel that a lot of the root is you didn't get to say everything that, you know, you wanted to say to your grandfather. But as I look back as an adult, I'm sorry, those were some smart people, but you don't take 8 months to figure out that he just needs to say some final words to his grandfather.
That's pretty interesting stuff. I have no idea where to begin with that. I mean, to be honest with you, I can't even begin. Don't even know where to start. Like, as far as what to even ask. I mean, I can't imagine anybody who has gone through this, the state asylum. Nowadays, I believe they've, it's been long since torn down. Maybe portions of the building are still remain, but I know that it's been turned into that land has been turned into apartment complexes, I believe.
Several years ago, they had a fire there that the main building, the main intake building, they lost it to fire. And that area is it's been redeveloped into,
it's a ballpark now.
Yeah, ballpark.
And condos.
Yeah, townhouses, condos, something like that. There's still several of the old buildings there on the grounds. Some of them have been repurposed. I know the state of South Carolina still uses them for some state government offices for like DHEC and places like that, But, all of us have heard the stories. And, it's what has blown my mind is to actually meet someone that experienced that. And because you only heard the stories and it was so far departed from, I don't know, maybe my small mind and everything else, the reality. Well,
if you would let me, I just want to say what you're feeling right now, which I'm kind of gauging, is very much how I felt, because we had all heard the stories before I even went there. I was scared crapless, but I was so scared that, I will say this, and I'm not going to lie, there was horrible times there, but there was a camaraderie with your fellow peers of the likes you just wouldn't imagine. So much so that, shameless self-plug here, I'm pretty sure I'm going to keep it an open book. I don't want to profit from it. I don't feel I should. But I've recounted some of my detailed experiences there. Oh. And it's basically, I'm with the book, I'm up to chapter 5, and I'm pretty much, I'm barely through the first few months. But there was lots of stories that were verbally imparted to me that were even more horrific than you could imagine while I was there, because also at a certain level, I got to interact with other adult patients there that were on that same level to where they could freely roam around the campus. They didn't separate the two. And just, at another time when we have more time, I'll be happy to, if we ever want to cover some of those stories, I have a wealth of them. But just to get back on topic, that was, I also know now that there was attachments running around that place, and I still haven't ruled out that, if the attachment theory is correct, that was one of the places that I got quite a few of them.
That would not surprise me. And man, the investigator side of me would have loved to be in one of those old buildings on a Saturday night. But
Well, surprisingly, I think the building you were trying to refer to was the Babcock building.
yes,
Yeah, it was one I never got to go into, but back in the 80s, it was known for certain patients that wanted, male-female patients that wanted to have privacy would break into it. That's all it was known for, but I was told it was closed for very horrific reasons.
yeah, it was. It did not have a good history on it whatsoever. So as we come kind of to the end of the your notes here, March 9th, 1993, you start out the topic as the beheading of your mom. What I take it that this is kind of our conclusion here, but for what we're talking about. But can you explain to us how this holds special to you?
At risk of sounding like someone that doesn't have empathy, respect for the dead, or is just trying to go for shock value, my dark sense of humor is very much my coping mechanism, and this has been a part of it for a long time. The reason I titled it as it was is because that actually happened. March 9th, 1993, but let me shoot to March 8th, 1993. Myself and the other two Michaels. You had a Micah and two Michaels that were going to go out to the Purple Gator in Myrtle Beach to see a band called Dylan Fence. I had won tickets off the radio, and we were going. And as I was waiting for them to come pick me up, me and my mother were having a cigarette on the back steps. And she said, "Micah, I had a dream last night." And I said, "Now, to be clear, my mother and I could be in the worst argument whatsoever, mad as heck at each other, but if one of us said, 'I had a dream,' the other listened intently and gave their interpretation of it." My mother told me, she said, "Mike, I had a dream last night that I looked up, I was laying down, and my three brothers were looking down at me with very solemn looks on their faces. And when I got up, they kept looking where I was laying. I saw everyone I knew and loved. Everyone was dressed real nice, but no one could hear me." She said, "And then I saw Aunt Jeanette, who's a very special lady in our family. She's very, very wise, to say it minimally, and she's very good with dreams. She said, I saw Aunt Jeanette, and I looked at her and said, 'What's going on?' She said, Aunt Jeanette looked me straight in the eyes and didn't say a word, just started crying. And then she gave a long pause. So I said, 'Mom,' and I'll never forget the words. These are verbatim. They're burned in me. I said, 'Mom, I've spent most of my life analyzing my dreams, what they mean, what they're trying to say. But sometimes, Mom, a dream is just a dream.' I told her that because I saw how it troubled her, and I didn't want her to feel that way, because I knew the theme, obviously, that she was giving. The following day, I had just walked in the door and saw my uncle in his deputy sheriff's car coming down the road. I had a 12-pack of beer in my hand, and I'm so worried that he saw it. So I went and stashed it in my room. I run in the bathroom. I had a beer that afternoon, and, I'm only 19, not supposed to do it. And I started brushing my teeth real quick, and when my Uncle Craig, he came up to the door, he saw me brushing my teeth. He went to go say something, and he just couldn't. And he said to his older brother, my older uncle, Harold. He said, Harold, he's in here. My Uncle Harold walked up and he said, Micah, we need to talk to you. Come in here. And that's when I went and sat down with my Uncle Harold, my Uncle Craig, and Aunt Kathy. That's when he told me, he said, Micah, Clark and Janice were in a bad accident, and your mom didn't make it. And I immediately reflected to that dream, and I'd have to tell you, my mother told me so many points in my life that she would always speak in a kind of a creepy tone. She goes, Micah, I'm not always going to be here. One day I'm going to be gone. But she said it excessively. At that very moment, I saw why she did it. Because that moment that should have thrown me into tears, something else clicked in me. I made myself cry in front of them, while part of me inside was going, wow, it was not just a dream. My mother gave me whether she did it on purpose or not, it worked to that effect. I was able to take it. Of course, later that evening, I bawled like a little baby that lost his mom, because that's what happened. But apparently in Andrews, South Carolina, her and my stepfather had just finished deciding on the plans for their dream home that they were going to break ground on in a few weeks. And there was a stop sign that was slightly overgrown. My stepfather wasn't paying attention. He ran the stop sign, and a tractor trailer hit her side of a 1986 Honda Accord. She was killed instantly. I did not know the details for almost a year. I just knew that she went quick. She didn't know what happened. And logic tells me that, to a degree, no matter how graphic, that's a blessing for anyone. I discovered via accident, someone let it slip up. Someone that didn't know that was my mother. That the entire town came together and hid the fact that she actually was decapitated in that accident. That's something that they left out of the news reports and things of that nature. And from what I was told, everybody was scared that it would just drive me over the edge. And when I confronted one of my best friends about it, I'm like, did you know this? And she's like, yes, Micah, everybody knew it. We kept it from you. We didn't want to see you go over the edge and do anything to your stepfather or, you know, or the person that struck the vehicle. I was like, well, you know, you guys obviously didn't know me, because the way my mama raised me, yeah, I would not have liked hearing that, but that would just reassert to me she didn't suffer. And, you know, it being a hard situation, and one thing I would like to say, someone approached me with, that loved my mother as the entire town did. Except they approached me with the name of the gentleman that drove that truck that struck her. They gave me his information. They did so under the premise I was going to get revenge. They wanted to see me get revenge. So I told them I'll make use of this information. And I'm proud to say, I did track that man down. He had the same first and last name as one of my best friends growing up. I'll leave it at that. So that was kind of interesting, but I had already decided what I was going to do. I contacted this man. I made him aware of who I was. And I said, look, the way my mother raised me and what I know she would have wanted, she would want me to let you know it was an accident. and it was not your fault. It was just a bad situation. And what you're going through, you actually have my compassion too. I may have lost a mother, but I can only imagine the details you have to live with. But just know this, the way my mother was and the way I am, we very much forgive you. That didn't make some people happy, but I know I did the right thing. And I'll just leave that one there.
That's a tough thing to do, man. And it is, like I said, it's the right thing, but it is, even when a parent dies, sometimes it's even hard not to be mad at the parent for leaving, but to be able to forgive the person that was, had some responsibility or, that was involved in it. That is something else to be able to do. And that's to be commended, man.
Well, thank you. Just one thing I'd like to quickly add to that. At her funeral, my stepfather, he survived the accident because the vehicle was split in two and he didn't have a safety belt on. His hands immediately gripped the steering column and he went with the first half. He was, when he got to the hospital, he will tell you, he told me the story of when an angel walked in, because he kept asking, what about Janice? What about Janice? Where's she? And finally, he got one of the doctor's attentions because he's horribly injured. He can't walk. His face is just torn up with the glass. And a doctor casually walked by and said, oh, she didn't make it, sir. Sorry. And walked away very heartless. He found out his wife died at that moment. And he said he just began wailing. No one was paying any attention to him. They weren't working on him. They were with someone else. And he said, Micah, this little old lady walked in and she held my hand and I cried holding her hand. And then when I looked up, when the doctors came in, she was gone. And, I don't hold it against him. He was a father to me growing up, and I know how much he loved my mother, and I know what an accident is. There's, everybody says, well, you got to feel something because, things could have been done, but that's not going to occur now. In hindsight, everything's 20/20. But with something like that, is it worth losing both your family members over the loss of one? No. And he's still my friend, and I consider him one of my fathers to this very day.
Thank you, Micah, for sharing that. I know it's probably not easy for you to recount this as many times as you've told it, and I'm sure it never gets any easier. But with that being said, thank you for sharing that with us. All of this information that you've decided to share with us. I will say I just have one question out of all of this. And not to take away from the moment here. But I'm curious, like during your times through your time at MUSC, the state asylum, and things of that nature. But I'm curious, did you have any, I don't want to call them episodes, but did you have any doppelganging situations? Did you have any anything dark like what we've talked about before? Did any of that occur during this time?
During the time immediately after, okay. No. And I can see why you asked that question because of the relative proximity of losing my grandfather to and that first situation where something allegedly took the form of me and went to school that day. I can say of what I know, I don't believe so. But there, again, just like I learned with the details of the loss of my mother, there very well could have been something that occurred no one's told me.
Because I'll be honest with you, when you started telling us about when she was retelling her dream to you, I thought that she was going to tell you that dream that she had was what you described to us back the dream you had back in 1976. That's where my mind kind of went to, and I was like, how wild would it have been if they had the exact same dream? But also on the same hand, yeah, I mean, just kind of curious if anything, as if real life isn't enough for one person. I mean, I was just curious if anything had, was popping its head around or anything like that. So I just thought I'd ask that question. But once again, thank you for sharing these events with us. Joey, you got anything you'd like to add?
No, huge thank you, Micah. There's a lot for us to even process from here. And I feel sure we're going to be reaching out to you some more on some of this stuff as we look at it, and especially when we get to the editing and stuff like that, all the dirty side of doing these things, the work side. But it's an immense story for someone to have to deal with, and to come out the other side now. We don't know you personally, but obviously being willing to step up and talk about it is, and bring it to let other people know that, obviously you're not the only one, but to let people know it's not stigmatized, and that people should be able to tell their stories about, what they've experienced and what they've dealt with, and all of that. And it's really brave to do that, and to let people understand, and it's okay to let that go and get it out there, because, in a way it's cathartic, and it helps with the processes. So again, I can't thank you enough for spending your time with us, Micah.
You're very welcome on everything you thanked me for. And I'm going to say that this is very much, there's two sides of the coin here, because as I've aged, I've wanted to get all this out in the right format. I've never told this story as I've told it now. I would see amazing things and have amazing takes on things that I shared when I was younger, to the point where it was so fascinating that I was seeing in reality. I quit sharing them because people thought I was making them up. And that kind of held me back for a long time. But I dare say this is very self-therapeutic for me right now as well.
And just to add on that note, as an immense story as this is, ladies and gentlemen, we're not done yet. There's going to be a third part to this, because we just can't fit it all into 2 episodes. But I'm really interested to get to this last part. There were some other images that Micah had shared with me, and of a hand-drawn sketch of his that he had done. And I'm not going to give anything away, but you're going to want to stick around for this last and final part. Micah, once again, thank you for being here on the show, and we'll set it up for a third and final episode with Micah Singleton.
Gentlemen, I thank you very much for having me, and not to mention, I'd just like to tell your listeners, I only just discovered you guys right out a week ago, and I got to say, being a Georgetonian, being a sandlapper, being a person that somewhere in one of these junk drawers still has my Happy Rain fan club card, it's good. And I feel I made very much the right choice reaching out to some fellow locals.
Well, thank you very much, Micah. We do appreciate that.
Yes, thank you again.
Yeah.